turn now, I have the privilege of teeing up our session today first panel. And it's continuing a theme of our mission and our 2020 convening. And so I'm really happy to welcome a panel of experts who will provide research and evidence-based insights on the current landscape for women, LGBTQ plus individuals, and people with intersection racial identities targeted for bias in STEM fields and society. This panel is going to reflect on what STEM societies can do to change the landscape, including critical standard setting, networking, mentoring, and so much more. I do want to flag that we had hoped to include an expert whose research addressed inclusion and equity for the LGBTQ plus community in STEM. We were not able to make that arrangement at this time, but I want to flag for you that with the great leadership of Shirley Diamond of Out to Innovate, we have a breakout on this topic during the day. Clearly, this area warrants more research and attention, and we're committed to that and looking forward to engagement on that front. During the panel Q&A, this is your homework. Please use the Q&A function to write comments or questions for our panelists. We'll do as much as we can to lift up those questions in the time remaining, and we're to build in some time for that. Use your raise hand function for the Q&A, and the chat function will be disabled during plenaries. And now my most fun task of the day is to introduce a good friend and colleague and a longtime supporter from the get-go of the Society's Consortium, Vicki Magley, who is professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut. Vicki, we're so grateful for your expertise and your contributions, selfless contributions over time. Vicki's going to be moderating our panel, and so Vicki, let me pass the baton to you to tee it up. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Art. I am super excited to be moderating this session, and am just amazed at the expertise and the willingness of our panelist participants. I'm going to provide just a really brief introduction right now of each of our panelists and then put them on the spotlight for a 5-ish minute overview of their contribution to this panel, after which we're going to have some me-directed questions to the panelists. And then following that, we will do the Q&A. And as Art mentioned, this is where we need you to participate. So I really do hope that you will start jotting down questions as you have them while the panelists are presenting, so that we can get those questions brought forth at the end, because I really hope that we can all learn from this panel in the best ways possible. So again, our panelists are just amazing. These are amazing contributors to this realm in terms of how things are progressing in creating more equitable, inclusive environments, particularly in the STEM arena. Dr. Eve Higginbotham is professor of ophthalmology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's also the Vice Dean for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. The part of the reason that she's part of this panel is that she chaired the recently released National Academy's consensus study on investigating the potential impact of COVID-19 on the careers of women in academic science, engineering, and medicine. And she will be joined in presentation by Dr. Maria Lund Dahlberg. And Dr. Dahlberg was the study director for this important report. And let me tell you, having been on a consensus study with the 2018 sexual harassment work, these study directors are the heart of these reports. So, so her contribution is just tremendous in this way. And actually, I think it probably would be better to go ahead and just do the introductions before the presenters. So I will hold off on introducing the next presenters until we get done with each of the presentations. So I'll turn it over to the two of you, Dr. Higginbotham and Dr. Dahlberg.
Great. Well, thank you. We are both so happy to be here to present at least the highlights of this report very, very briefly. This is a report that took place in the middle of the pandemic. We convened a group of 9 scholars from across the country, as well as across disciplines, to tackle the topic of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the careers of academic women in STEM. I have one slide that I'll just share with you to give you a brief highlight of the results of a survey, a convenient survey that was done by Kosick, Allen, and Dumas that included questions about the impact of COVID-19 on the work effectiveness of academic women in STEM. The survey included postdocs and faculty and graduate students. But certainly you can see that there are 4 categories of impacts: increased workload and or hours worked, decreased productivity, difficulty interacting with colleagues and students, and challenges of changing teaching mode. There was also a negative impact on research and less time to do work. We can take the slide down at this point. We will be actually talking about this a little bit more in one of our breakout sessions, but in the first few minutes here, let me just share with you some of what we learned about the potential long-term impacts that we know historically, the role of technology and the role of professional societies, because this is not our first stressor socially that we've had in this country. And we've learned what has happened from previous stressors, such as Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf region, which really negatively impacted the careers of women, not only generally, but particularly those who were in their early careers in STEM. And so we know that this will have a significant negative impact on careers down the line. We know also that restricting or canceling participation in professional organization conferences, which occurred regularly in the early spring of 2020, which really got us or caught us all off guard, really did actually eliminate future collaborations that could have occurred and would have been born in conferences that would have been held at that time. Technology certainly has had a significant role as we are communicating today virtually and still having a meeting, but we don't have that rich opportunity for networking and collaboration that you'll find at coffee counters, at conferences, or in hallways. Often family obligations during COVID-19 pandemic may deter or hinder the ability to collaborate, even if remote options are open and accessible. So technology is a good thing, but it also blurs the boundaries between work as well as home life. And then finally, we know the significant role that professional societies have played previously in pandemics. One example is the AAAMC during Hurricane Katrina really worked together with institutions that were actually impacted to help faculty gain access to research resources as well as students to gain access to much needed classes, as well as opportunities to continue their education and research elsewhere. So professional societies have played a significant role and will continue to play a significant role. And so that's going to be the topic that we will be delving in more significantly during our Q&A. Maria?
Thank you, Eve. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today about particularly our report on the impacts of COVID-19 on women. As building on Eve's brief remarks just now, as you all know, the role that a lot of these professional organizations took and have taken historically altered dramatically during 2020. And a lot of the organizations built on the technology that was allowed and provided to develop new ways of holding their conferences and events and engaging with their membership. and really thought about how to do this with a more inclusive lens, to broaden the access to their resources, to reimagine conferences, to reimagine their meetings, developed and built and expanded online communities and affinity groups and other mechanisms to really engage with others in their networks. However, as we all know, this didn't eliminate concepts around bias that occur in virtual environments. And I think it's really important to make sure we keep our eye on those aspects. And I think it's something that we are all very aware of. It came through in our report as well. One survey that we highlighted in the report was a survey by SWE that was fielded between early and mid-June of 2020. Nearly a third of the SWE professionals who reported experiencing bias during virtual meetings. And I should note this, the survey was fielded primarily with women and individuals who identified as non-binary. This bias took place in terms of being talked over or being interrupted, being ignored more frequently during virtual meetings versus those that were held in person. They disaggregated that data by various age groups, and it was, primarily younger professionals and versus those who were over age 55 to 64 who felt that they were being ignored or interrupted. And also, it should be noted that when a commission paper that contributed to our report did a review of public-facing web pages of more than nearly 250 STEM professional organizations, they didn't really find great evidence of steps that those organizations were taking to combat this bias for women in virtual meetings, and or being intentional about how to highlight different presentations or keynotes and resources written by women during the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's not all sort of doom and gloom. I think that there's a really important role that professional societies can play in terms of the mentorship and the sponsorship, particularly of women in STEM. And it's been shown multiple times that the career trajectories and the success of women in STEM is often better supported through really fantastic mentorship and sponsorship programs, particularly peer support networks and interventions can help reduce or help address reduced opportunities, for interactions between colleagues and social, or it can increase, reduce that sense of social isolation, particularly that was felt during the COVID-19 pandemic. It can also help impact the senses of psychological well-being and various other forms of career outcomes. So I think one thing that was found during our work on the impact of COVID-19 is that this high impact function that many professional organizations through sponsorship, through setting up mentoring programs, coupled with that technical and scientific work that is done, can really shift how women can succeed and how they can thrive, even during these times of crisis. And I welcome the additional conversations that we'll be having during our breakout group to explore these topics further.
Thank you so much. I think that I am unmuted and you can hear me, but I don't think you can quite see me yet. I am pleased to bring forth our next speaker. There we go. Our next speaker is Dr. Carlotta Arthur, and she is the program director for the Claire Booth Luce program. This is the nation's most significant funder of women in STEM higher education. Dr. Arthur also co-leads the crafting of the Luce Foundation's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, and has worked to significantly increase the number of minority serving institutions that are supported by this program. So I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Arthur.
My apologies, I had trouble unmuting, which I think is what we've been hearing for the last year and a half repeatedly. Thank you, Vicki, for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me now. And thank you to the Society's Consortium team for inviting me to participate. In addition to the work of the Claire Booth Luce program, which is the core of the foundation's, the Henry Luce Foundation's STEM-focused work, another goal that we have is to shift the STEM ecosystem to be more equitable and inclusive, as well as to broaden the participation of women of color in STEM. Strategic philanthropy has a significant role to play in driving change. Many think of foundations primarily as grant makers and believe that our only source of influence is financial in the form of the grants that we make. However, we have other tools in our toolbox. And in fact, I actually see a number of parallels between the tools that we leverage in strategic philanthropy and the tools available for use by professional societies. First and foremost, we approach everything that we do with an equity lens. And again, in this way, we're in close alignment with the consortium's vision that was shared just earlier in this event. We leverage our processes and model best practices. So we incorporate research and learnings from the field on what works into our work, including, for example, in our applications for grants. Questions such as organizations and institutions' policies and practices for mentoring, for provision of childcare, and efforts to foster a sense of belonging into STEM are built into our applications for the Claire Booth Luce program, for example. We also take collaborative approaches and engage in what I call strategic risk-taking. So we partner with other organizations and institutions from across multiple sectors to catalyze change. We're not in competition with our fellow foundations or with public sector funders. So there's no reason why we can't partner and leverage those partnerships to move change forward. In fact, as private foundations, we're often in the positions to take strategic risks. We don't wait around for others to do it first and see what happens. We can step out in front and fund programs and projects. For example, the Luce Foundation funded the initial scoping workshop for the National Academy's sexual harassment study. And so we were able to do that because we're, again, strategic risk takers based on what we knew about the research and evidence in the field. This was a topic that was of critical importance. We can also leverage our voice as respected and trusted in the field. Given our more than 30-year investment in the STEM diversity space, we can use our platform and voice to elevate issues that are of importance to us, to our grantees and to the sector, to shift narratives and drive change. An example of this is a recent grant that we made intended to elevate the voices of women of color and narratives of Black and Indigenous women in STEM, sharing their contributions and centering their lived experiences, countering the marginalization of their voices and existing deficit narratives that are out there in the field. Professional societies, again, have multiple tools in their toolboxes as well that can be used to shift narratives and to drive change. I know that some people I know think of professional societies primarily as membership organizations, as communities of professionals. However, by looking at everything the society does through an equity lens, societies can identify a multitude of opportunities to drive change. One thing that really stands out for me is that professional societies have the ability to define what it means to be a professional in your field. Further, you can look at all of your processes as an organization through an equity lens to see where there are opportunities for shifting your processes so that you're being more equitable and inclusive, for example, in how individuals obtain leadership roles in society, or with respect to awards that are prizes that are awarded by society. Professional societies can also collaborate and share knowledge, information, and learnings to catalyze change. So obviously the Societies Consortium is an example of this. And societies can leverage their voices to, given their trusted roles, to elevate narratives and to elevate voices and shift narratives in ways that are of importance to the society. We're also in philanthropy, in our strategic philanthropy at the Luce Foundation. We're a learning organization. We learn from our outcomes and incorporate those findings into our work. And this creates a continuous feedback loop that we hope will ultimately make our work better and even more impactful. And I see societies having the ability to do exactly the same. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much. And we now have our final speaker. Dr. Shirley Malcom is a joy and pleasure to be around, among other things, but she is also the senior advisor of to the CEO and director of the Sea Change Initiative at the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. She works to improve the quality and increase access to education and careers in STEM fields, as well as to enhance public science literacy. Highly acclaimed and with 16 honorary degrees, she notably is the 2003 recipient of the National Academies of Sciences Public Welfare Medal, the highest award given by the Academy. I'm very pleased to direct us now to Dr. Malcom.
Thank you so much. And I am pleased to be here and to be a part of this panel. And I look forward to your questions, Vicki, and to the exchange, the opportunities for exchange that we will have. One of the things that being old allows you to do is to look back on a lot of lived history and understand kind of how did we get to this point. I came to the AAAS the first time in 1975. And my boss at that time, Janet Brown, asked a question about whether or not there were specific issues that women of color faced. This was because she had been in a number of different project director meetings that the National Science Foundation had held to look at intervention programs that were being established and funded by the foundation. And when she went to the program directors meeting that was focused on minoritized populations, all of the other project directors, the PIs of all of those were men. And then she went to the meeting of PIs for the women's programs that NSF was funding. And all of the PIs in that session were white. And so asking that question in 1975 was really, I think, the beginning of an awakening that, in fact, women of color experienced the STEM areas very differently. And we had the first double bind conference in December of 1975 and published the double bind report in 1976. The reason I relate this history is because that was really the first time that we had shown a bright spotlight on women of color within STEM. And what we found were issues that really weren't, in fact, definable either by looking through a lens of minoritized populations, nor looking through just the gender lens. And it began to really kind of situate us in a space where we knew that we had to focus specifically and independently on issues that relate at the intersection, whether that is the intersection of race and gender, or whether that is the intersection of race and disability, or gender and disability, or LGBTQIA+. But in fact, that we had to look at people who were experiencing these environments in multiple ways at the same time. The introduction of the concept of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw gave us a powerful, I think, analytic tool. But the real challenge, though, is that in spite of the fact that we've been wrestling with these issues since the 1970s, unfortunately, when you read the double bind, sections of it sound as though they could have been written yesterday. I am pleased that other organizations have become aware of the need to look at the intersectional spaces. And I would compliment that, in fact, in the work that the Academy has done around sexual harassment, that the issues that are faced by women who are at the intersectional space were not only highlighted, but they were, in fact, articulated in a way to help us understand that we are basically experiencing some of the worst of whatever it is. And this is the case in almost every indicator that we look at. So when AAAS began its work on SEA Change, STEM Equity Achievement Change, to try to develop a platform, a scaffolding to enable institutional transformation, we looked at our colleagues in the UK and Athena Swan, and we adapted a lot of the things from Athena Swan. But one of the ways where we parted company from the beginning was that they had a separate race equity charter. And we said, we cannot do this. And we, in fact, have always included the intersectional space. This is something that a professional society basically did, and that was to highlight the issues of women of color within STEM from a long time ago, and to provide a narrative that others, including the data collection of the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, that others could in fact follow, as well as the attention to these issues within other studies that might have been done and subsequent work that might have been done. But in spite of this attention, we still live with the issue of the attendant invisibility and hypervisibility of the intersectional populations. And so I will stop at that point and suspect that we will delve into these concerns a lot more in the panel discussion. So thank you. Vicki, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to give us 1 second to get everybody pinned back up. If all of the panelists could turn their videos back on again. I think that will take just a tiny little second here. I actually think I can actually help too. Oops, I might have just done something bad.
You're good, Vicki.
Okay. Oh golly. Okay, I'm no longer seeing kind of, I think, what everybody else is seeing, unfortunately. Oh, there we go. Okay. I figured out what I did. Sorry. Zoom still baffles me on occasion. You'd think would have gotten better with it. So we had these brief introductions purposefully to give everybody a slight opening to kind of what these contributions are in these areas and how is it that things are changing. And I just wanted to highlight some of the words that came out. That Maria, for instance, said that we are reimagining. And don't you feel like kind of all of this is in some ways reimagining? When we think about the role of professional societies, we are reimagining and trying to understand what the future is without having really a good sense of what it can be in some ways, right? And how do we bring in other arenas of knowledge to try to help this change within the professional society world, right? Carlotta talked about strategic philanthropy work, right? Strategic risk-taking, thinking about collaborative efforts. I just think that these are some pieces that are just so central to what we need to be kind of moving forward. Shirley, when you raised this historic view that this idea of the double bind started 45 years ago, I had to stop and kind of count my decades. Right? It's like, really, can it really be 45 years? Yes, it's 45 years ago. That it's taken a long time, and we need to move forward. I think part of what you didn't say necessarily so much in a word, that it was like picking out other people's words, but I think the urgency of this change is what I took from kind of part of what you were saying, that this has gone on too long. We really need to make changes. And I am so thrilled that all of the participants here today are here because of a desire to make these kinds of changes. It really makes me happy. So I really would like to throw some questions to our panelists in terms of like some specific kinds of things, but also thinking about some broad types of issues, and whoever is interested in kind of taking on a broad issue, I'll direct some questions, but if people want to jump in on a broad issue, please feel free to do so. But I think one of the things that is really important is, you know what, actually, I think I'm going to hold this toward the end. Never mind. I'm going to reorder my questioning here. If we think about our success in moving forward with any of the changes that professional societies are making, I'd like for each of you to really think about one or two most important pieces. So if you had to think about what roles professional societies have in, just like a sentence fragment, right? Not even necessarily a sentence. What is most important in your mind about kind of these next steps, these next moments? And it can cover kind of anything that you want. And I'll wait for somebody to jump in, but otherwise I'm going to start pointing at people. So one or two most important things as we're moving forward.
I'll get started. I would say, I'm sure that just about every professional society does a needs assessment at some point. And it's important to stratify that needs assessment so that you can really understand the various needs of all of your members based on self-identity. That's the only way that we can get to a level of intersectionality and address the needs of everyone in the organization. Oftentimes, a needs assessment will just have one broad view without really digging beneath the surface.
So I'm going to add into that to make sure that in that needs assessment, you need to make sure that you're asking those kind of categorical questions as well to try to be able to do that, right? Which isn't always done. So making certain that those, race, ethnicity, gender, identity-based questions are included in that kind of a needs assessment.
Yeah, I would say it should be a very broad view of ancestry because people self-identify in so many different ways. So it has to go beyond what the federal categories are, because I think that too is evolving.
Good point.
I would note, and I think this actually comes back to some of the framing remarks that Billy Williams put forward, right? Is this iterative process, and this comes through our Women in COVID report was actually built on another report that was released in February of 2020, which we shorthand to promising practices for addressing the underrepresentation of women in STEM. And it lays out a whole slew of recommendations built on what we knew from before times, right? And one of the primary sort of takeaway messages from that report is that you do this sort of needs assessment and analysis of what you have in play. And if you do it right, as Eve just mentioned, you understand really the full breadth of who's involved in that. And then you iterate, you pilot an idea forward, and you assess that as well as you're going forward. And I think it's really important to understand, as you're putting forward these new ideas, these new pilots, that you take into context the context in which you're putting them forward as some solution that's going to work right now, as we're still mostly all virtual, as we're still going through collective trauma, as we're still experiencing all of these different things. That solution isn't going to be the same as what you would have done before, as what you're going to do in the future. And you need to be aware of what those solutions are going to look like and be open to them evolving and changing as they move forward. And keep asking.
Excellent.
And I would just also add to look at everything through an equity lens. So even as an organization is thinking about doing that needs assessment, it wouldn't be necessarily the same way. You wouldn't necessarily do that needs assessment the same way that you did it in the past. You really need to look at your process and ensure that that process of doing the needs assessment isn't biased in some way. So, taking a step back and looking at everything that the organization does using that equity lens, just to make sure that there isn't bias built into the way you do things that's going to ultimately affect the outcomes that you get.
I love everything that everybody else said. And I just want to add, I think is my vantage point on this, is the need for societies to articulate inclusiveness as a part of their narrative on what they value. Because I love the language that came out earlier about standard setters and standard bearers. And if you're going to set the standards, having this kind of inclusiveness as a clear value that of the field and of the discipline and of the work, I think is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. I keep saying to whomever I can say it to and whoever will listen to me, that until we get inclusion as part of all mission statements, that we're not going to see change, because it really has to be driving kind of everything. And it doesn't start driving until it's really accepted as a core mission value kind of moments. Absolutely.
Vicki,
Yeah.
let me just raise one issue with you, and that is that I think that many of our members might think that we are kind of trading off excellence, and they might even say it, for inclusion. And I think that we have to be very explicit that that's not what is happening. And that in fact, if you're not, I don't know how you're going to be excellent if you're not inclusive.
Absolutely. Point well made. So when we think about this idea of needs assessments and, like the pieces of iterative processing and these kinds of things, how do we understand then kind of what might be short-term and long-term indicators of success? Where do we sort of see, in projecting forward, we need to, once we figure out what our needs are, we need to set up some markers for ourselves. And I hate the word metrics. I will put it out there. I really hate that word, but we need to have them, right? We need to have some kind of ideas around that. But it isn't all about long-term metrics. What are some potential short-term metrics of success that all of you might put forth for our professional societies? Anybody?
Well, I would say you can't have metrics unless you have some strategy in mind and some intentionality around goals. So you need to have a strategic framework that will drive your metrics over time. And there's certain low-hanging fruit, very easy to actually put on your list at this point. First of all, recognize I've been in academia for 40 years. And it's a matter of actually acknowledging the fact that you cannot get promoted in academia unless you have oral presentations, that you have your abstracts accepted at meetings, that you have a chance to work on a scientific paper on behalf of the professional society, that you're named to a major committee, is to recognize that we need to recruit individuals of color, because oftentimes we are not in those inner networks who's asked to be part of those teams or to present major findings. We need to be cognizant at all levels of the need to be inclusive in the kinds of people that are presenting and participating in that work. That's low-hanging fruit that can be done without really completing a strategic plan.
And I appreciate that correction in terms of like the ideas of having goals before you really start talking about metrics. That's a great point. Great point.
I don't want to like just go in the exact same order every time we answer the questions, but I'm going to. I think there are two things that keep on bouncing into my head, and one is that you highlighted the word from my talk about reimagining, and I think that it's been a super disruptive time period, but we have this opportunity to try and create the new systems, to set those goals in a way that will be more inclusive and will be better representative and will be more engaging and will have, a better set of outcomes, and create another project I'm working on right now uses the phrase the next normal, right? Will be a system that we're actually want to engage in more. And I think the professional societies have a huge role. You've just listed, the low-hanging fruit aspects of that. I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that inclusion is not assimilation. We're not looking for people who happen to have a certain gender or a certain background or certain identity standards, but also still fit with what we already want them to be. You need to expand what those definitions are, expand how you want to include those perspectives, really engage that diversity that you are touting so much as being a good outcome. If you just want diversity and then immediate assimilation, you lose any of the benefits from the diversity that we all know from research is actually important. So I think it's an opportunity for an actual, not moving the needle, but paradigm shift in how we engage in this.
Fully reimagining, like fully reimagining. Absolutely. Other thoughts on this?
I'm sorry.
No, please.
Oh, I just wanted to add that in addition to goals, I believe that in terms of thinking longer term, it's really important to think about what kind of impact that you ultimately want to have. What do you want how do you want the world to be different when this work has all been envisioned and strategized? What is the change that you really want to see in the world, in addition to those goals, which may be shorter term? And I just want to also just agree with everything that Maria just shared about it being really important to define what inclusion means, and to ensure that in the process of defining inclusion, again, an equity lens is being used so that inclusion doesn't mean something that's going to be restrictive or that's going to to negatively impact those that we're trying to lift up and elevate.
There are a lot of opportunities, and I love the discussion that has gone on. And you're absolutely right, Eve. The low-hanging fruit's just sitting there staring you in the face in terms of the way that you put together meetings, the convenings, the outreach, the inclusiveness within the program, being attentive to the policies. I think all of us now have policies about expected behaviors within our meetings, whether they're online or in person, around harassment, et cetera, and the civility we expect and the respect that we expect. But you know, the things that are really that have been made possible because of the pandemic. And I know that sounds bizarre, but you're absolutely right. There's been sufficient disruption that you can rethink and reinvent and reimagine. That means, though, that in some cases we have to rethink, reinvent, and reimagine our fields themselves, because in some cases, the very paradigms on which our fields rest need to be re-examined. And I give one example from research that was done that talked about some of our fields of study having prominent within their members the idea that you can only do this work if you are innately able to do this work. Well, guess what? That's cutting out a whole bunch of people from the beginning, because the definitions of this kind of innately able to do this work drive certain kinds of compositional issues, lower numbers of women, lower numbers of people of color, because the assumption going in is they can't do this. And so I do think that having the societies begin to actually grapple with the kind of these very foundational issues and trying to look at the kinds of climate and culture that may have contributed to this in the beginning, that's going to be the harder job, because it's going to mean changing standards and changing behaviors that have accompanied those previous standards.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I am going to remind all of our participants that we have this lovely Q&A feature down at the very bottom of your screen, that if you would please start posting questions. I can talk. Our panelists clearly can talk, right? But we want to hear from you as well during this time. So please put in questions into the Q&A box so that we can start thinking about how to integrate those into our conversation. Our session goes until 2:35, and soon I would like to be able to start shifting into your questions, not just my questions, because we want to make sure that we are incorporating what your needs are in this panel. Okay, so I'm pointing to all of you right now to put in your questions. Okay. So I do have I have lots of other questions, but I do want to raise one thing that is thinking back to, and some of you addressed it already a little bit in your brief introductions, but you're all coming at these issues from pretty different perspectives, right? And if you had to take one or two things from kind of the work that you've been doing and saying how is this one or two thing kind of the most translatable piece of what you've been doing and talking and writing about to professional societies, what would be that one or two things from your work that you think is best in terms of the professional society's work?
I want to start because I want to just put out there the possibility that professional societies can work together to develop departmental level sea change awards. And I put that out there because if you can get to the point where you can define what an excellent department is around a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and make the idea of getting an award for your department because of this, not one that you keep forever, but that you have to keep renewing so that you can keep getting better. But if you can begin to do that, you can steal a march on your competitors if you, in terms of departments. And so I think that offering this as a tool to incentivize change within the institutions and within the fields of the institutions can be a very powerful lever. And I do think that some of our societies have in fact already begun this process, because until they can actually, until our fields, our disciplines can shift what happens inside of the institutions that prepare our students, that conduct our research, that hold up in terms of the transfer of the values and the knowledge from one generation to the next. We're going to be fighting this battle when I'm long in the ground. And I just don't think, yes, you did hear frustration, Vicki. And I think that it is time to really take hold of this and use the tools we have.
And I would agree with everything that Shirley just said. In many ways, the grants that we award are you could think of them as awards. They're given to those institutions that have a demonstrated commitment to addressing these issues. They have policies and procedures in place. It's not just a matter of sharing the data on who's in their particular departments. It's what is your strategic plan? What's your vision? You know, are you providing mentoring? Are you providing childcare? So we're really measuring what they're doing and awarding our grants to the ones that are doing a good job. And then we're elevating them as exemplars in the field for what you can do. And I'm happy to talk to anyone who comes to me and says, well, what should we do? What can we do to get one of your awards? And I lay it all out for them. So leveraging, again, folks often think of it as just a pot of money, but we leverage our process and
Yes.
our knowledge to actually try to get those institutions, even the ones that don't get our grants. In fact, sometimes they're the ones that are listening the most because they want to know how they can get one. So we'll tell them all the things that they need to do in order to be successful. And those are all things that will hopefully shift their institutions, their departments to be more inclusive.
I think another thing that professional societies can do that really helps sort of fill in gaps and help out with this general space is, for a lot of people in STEM in particular, particularly people of color, particularly women of color, there's a huge amount of isolation within their departments. And often there's an opportunity to connect, to engage across institutions and institutional boundaries through professional societies, through mentoring, through collaboration, through connections that are made. And I think providing inclusive mechanisms and providing support systems, I think, is a really important function of professional societies. It's not entirely sure that it goes so far as being a full like third space, but it's a place that people can go that's outside of their normal workspace, that's outside of their home space. It still has a professional mechanism. It still provides a lot of that engagement, but it also provides mentoring, and it provides career development, and it provides a whole bunch of other support mechanisms that are really essential and that may not exist in their local environment. And I think that's an essential role for the professional societies. And it's just an essential one to think about how to get right now with the enhanced isolation that people have been feeling for the past coming on 2 years.
I certainly would concur with having an institutional focus. That's, I think, the thrust of our report from the National Academies. It's a matter of actually not just relying on personal agency and emphasizing that, but really demanding that institutions step up and really take a more prominent role in this space. I think not only do we have to define inclusion, but we also have to redefine diversity as well. I was the first African-American woman to be on the board of my professional society, the American Academy of Ophthalmology, and there wasn't another one for about 15 years after me. So you can't just have one person. There's got to be a critical mass, and usually you aim for about 30%. Usually when you're in an audience or when I'm in meetings where there are about 30% of individuals that share a common thread, whether it's gender equity or ancestral equity or any discussion related to any topic, the conversation doesn't really move significantly unless a third of the people in the audience are part of that realm. And certainly allies are very important, of course, as well in that space. But one person doesn't translate to a diverse group.
Amen to that. Right. And I think also in terms of like the allies piece, you're supporting one another in the moment, saying, oh, that's a great idea. What that person said is a great idea. Individual level support in that kind of way. So thank you, participants, for adding your questions into the Q&A. I'm so proud of you. I'm going to actually start with a couple of pointed questions in our remaining minutes that we have in our session. And so I'm going to first read part of the setup and such. And this is really to Maria, just FYI, so that you're paying close attention. So your stance on assimilation versus inclusion was poignant. As a Black woman scientist, I have felt this in almost every institution that I've worked in academia and in the private sector. How can institutional leaders begin to understand the difference between the two and foster a culture of belonging and inclusion that allows individuals to embrace their full identity? And if we can try to keep these answers pretty brief, if you can, just try to get to as many of the questions as we can.
So one, I'm going to point out the fact that I am the white woman on the panel answering a question about a Black women experience, and just note that. But I am being asked to talk about how leadership could possibly engage in this. I'm also going to point out that I'm probably the youngest person on the panel talking about leadership points. But so with those two sort of highlights in mind, I think, yeah, it's important. How you get leaders to recognize this is through the same sort of process that we talked about at the beginning of the Q&A process, right? If you do an analysis of your institution or of your field or wherever it is, and you're finding that at the top levels, at the leadership and the promotion process, and however you end up measuring a variety of things, certain individuals are succeeding more than others, something is flawed with your system, that there's some exclusionary principles that are going on. And then you have to go back to basics. Question what the fundamental mission that you are trying to accomplish, and why has your incentive, reward, promotion, advancement structure been aligned in a way that is only setting it up to reward certain individuals rather than others? What are you looking for in your promotion packages? What are you looking for in the paper topics that you are publishing? What are you looking for in all of these, grants that you are giving? How are these reward structures aligning, or more often than not, misaligning with your reward system or with the mission statements that you have put forward? And then how can you actively alter them so that they're better aligned? And then see what happens. And do intentional work to try and fix it. Take ownership of that. By
Any
the way,
other?
it won't be easy.
Don't expect it to be easy, correct? So any other little tiny tidbits additionally to add to that?
Let me,
Eve, in your
let me just say
own-
that if you keep getting the same thing, you got a problem with your process.
Eve, any thoughts in your own academic leadership role?
I have lots of thoughts.
Surprise.
Trying to figure out where to start. I mean, it's just, assimilation, so I would say that oftentimes as a woman of color in the majority institution, you're ignored. You are not actually acknowledged and respected. And so it goes to the core values of an institution. An institution and that leadership. The leaders have to be actually grounded in values of respect, inclusivity, just decency. But it's not unusual for me to walk down a hallway. I see someone coming my way. I know that person, but because it's out of context, they don't see me. So, and I know that that happens to so many of my colleagues. And so it goes to the core of what kind of institution do we have and what are their values, because it's always going to be assimilation unless you have that critical mass, and you can't get to that critical mass unless you have the processes that are going to actually get you to that point. So it starts with leadership. It starts with governance.
Yeah.
I've been on the governing boards of 2 institutions, Harvard and MIT, and I can tell you at that level, the conversations matter because it drives policies and behavior.
And a follow-up question to that, I think then in the Q&A is there's a burden then felt by women of color in particular and other marginalized groups in constantly being asked to be public, right? And to serve in these leadership roles while simultaneously building that pipeline. And so I think that's an equal kind of problem. Like there's a visibility that is needed. And at the same time, there's an overtax and a burden that's placed on that visibility as well because of the lack of representation, right? So any suggestions about how to try to mitigate that burden that is felt there?
You mean beyond cloning?
I think so.
Well, I'm sure that Eve probably feels it a lot more because she basically has to be a faculty member all at the same time as she's carrying about a lot of this other stuff. Fortunately for me, at my role as AAAS, yes, I had to basically do my job that I was assigned to do and was hired to do. But if I just showed up in the process of doing my job, I had to do both those things at the same time. There's a lot of education that you have to do for people. And there's a lot of, I think, I don't know how to say this, being obvious and being explicit that you have to do. And I hate that in some cases that means that I can't just be me and just talk about something else. I've got to bring the elephant into the room, because if I don't bring the elephant in, the elephant, well, somebody else will bring the elephant in and it will be their elephant, not mine. So I can basically bring the elephant into the room, deal with it, and then dispense with the elephant. And but that's a whole nother tax on your emotional and physiological, psychological. What if you don't want to deal with it that day?
Right. And so this is a burden that is not only just within the professional societies, but it's also within the field and within the home departments and within the discipline and, you know, all around lots of different levels. And I think that it's just incredibly important that we attend to this burden at the same time of recognizing the importance of representation. I don't think there's any great answers to this question in some ways, other than to acknowledge that it exists. Eve.
Just
Please.
a brief comment. One of our faculty members at Penn, I can't take credit for this phrase, but coined the phrase, you have to learn how to translate the tax into currency. Particularly in these times, I think when people are at least listening, institutions are listening since the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. And so this is a time to gain access to leaders in the institution who can actually become your new sponsors and make a difference. So
I like that.
I think
Love it.
translating Roy Hamilton, he is a neurologist at University of Pennsylvania. I cannot take credit, but I think it's a wonderful phrase.
I'm so glad you brought it in. So glad you brought that in.
Love it.
I think that might be the takeaway from this whole panel.
Yes.
Maybe not, but not the whole panel, but an important takeaway anyway. I have one more question that I think will probably wrap up our session. We end at 2:35. And I actually would like for each of us to try to address this one. And partially because it gets back to my initial question in some ways that I was going to start the panel with and then decided to punt to the end. And it's about sustainability. And it's a huge issue, right? So the comment question is, I love how Dr. Dahlberg brought up that we not only need to integrate diversity into our institutions or organizations teams, but we need to sustain and maintain the diversity and not inadvertently supporting assimilation. How? What are ways that we can do this maintenance of diversity in terms of the sustenance and sustaining this process? Who wants to go first?
I can
I
start.
don't mind going first.
Oh,
I don't
sorry.
mind going first. And I will just say that when we stood up Sea Change, we stood it up to be sustainable. And that was, sustainability was in the design. The idea that in fact, that there is iterative improvement, for example, that in fact, that there is membership, that you can get better and be incentivized and rewarded and recognized for getting better. And I think that if I were in a space where I had the opportunity to be held up as an exemplar, I'd stay there until I could become exemplary.
Carlotta?
I will add that it can't be an add-on. It has to be part of the strategic vision of the organization, the institution, starting with the governance, for example, and it would be sustainable as just like anything else that's important to the organization if it's built into their strategic vision of who they are. So, starting from that point is really important, and not thinking you can just add it on as an extra. It has to be core to what the organization is about.
And I would build on Carlotta's comments and said, not only the strategic vision, but the core values. It's got to be really deeply ingrained, because the core values really should be that glue that should live on in the institution. And it has to actually penetrate the entire enterprise, and it has to be structured. It's baked into infrastructure and processes.
Yes.
So as your leading indicators for success, infrastructure and processes, then you'll get the satisfaction of faculty who want to stay, or individuals who would like to stay in the organization.
Only thing I'm going to add to that, because basically I'm plus oneing everything that everybody has said so far, right? Iterative, making sure it's baked in, making sure it's structurally part of what's going on, is that you have to make sure that this isn't on a single person or a single group of people's shoulders, that this isn't going to be dependent on who is present, but that it is so ingrained with the way that is done that it is assumed to be part of the positions, all of the positions that will be touched upon. And whether that is, the graduate students who are engaged, or the president who's part of it and has, their own particular thing that they would like to take on, they're still will always have this one thread that sort of weaves throughout all of the work that's being done. It's not something that you give up.
That is amazing. I want to thank all of our participants who have asked additional questions in the Q&A that we didn't have time to get to. I thank you for those questions, and some of those questions may be absolutely relevant to the breakout sessions that we will be moving into later on this afternoon. So please keep hold of those, right? Jot them down somewhere if you posed a question and it didn't get answered, because I know that we didn't get to nearly all of them. But I truly appreciate all of the participants raising of the questions in that moment. So you did a good job. Yay for you. And I am so, so grateful to our panelists and being allowed to participate in this conversation with all of them. It's such an important moment. We are reimagining our futures. We are taking bold actions, risk-taking in strategic ways. And this is hard work. And it's such a blessing to learn from these leaders in this domain. And so I am so grateful to the work that they are all doing and their capacity for being willing to share that with us today.